Okay, so let's implement the reserve resource command now, along with the handler and a business logic behind the scenes.
Yeah, so this will give you a flavor of how the CQRS fits into our microservice. Yeah, and as you said, we'll start from the very bottom, so from the business logic, which will be right inside our aggregate, right? So we'll go to the resource first, implement the method. The method will be, of course, public, since this is our public API for looking from the aggregates perspective. So I think that we'll start right here.
Yeah, so let's start from the business. What's the most important part usually on our daily work? Okay, so let's open the resource. And for example, we could have a method here. Maybe let's just call it add reservation. And
yeah, this will accept the reservation. So
yeah, sure.
I think that it's worth mentioning that in our approach, we will pass the value object to the aggregate. And for some people, this seems unnatural. For some people, they prefer passing the arguments and create the value object inside the aggregate. So the aggregate root will be responsible for creating and accessing the value object. In this case, we'll simply stick to this one because this will not require any additional factory classes. It will be the code itself will be simpler, and besides that, the aggregate itself is pretty simple.
Yeah.
So
also, we will implement this logic inside this method on this resource aggregate. But if you were to use maybe some different implementations, different strategies, you could use strategy pattern. You could have some different policies on your domain level. So, but we'll just keep it in a single method because we will assume that this logic will not change. Okay, so at first let's check whether we already have the existing reservation, because if there is an existing one for the same date as the new one, we need to check the priority, and if the priority is higher, then we can remove the previous reservation. So let's look for the colliding reservation or the existing one, and here, as you remember,
because as far as I remember, the idea about this whole reservation and checking the collision is that we need to check whether we have the reservation already for the same date.
Yeah.
And then we need to check the priority. If this is if the incoming reservation has a higher priority, then we can expropriate this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll throw an exception.
Right. So we'll have like two possible branches. And as you might remember, our reservation is a struct, it's not a type. So we can really compare it to the null in this case when we will try to do some link. So maybe we can do it like this. Let's look for any reservation for this date. And because we will use the same expression, the same predicate twice, we can, for example, create a local function for this purpose, which will be a little bit more efficient anyway. So let's say has the same reservation date. And this one will accept the reservation R, and we'll simply compare the date with the new reservation date. And we can just pass this method here. Okay, so if we have the colliding reservation, so we can do a simple if check here, then it will mean that we need to find this reservation and actually compare the priorities.
Yes.
So let's find this one, reservations first, and then we can do, again, simple if the colliding reservation priority is higher or equal to this new reservation priority, then that should result in an error.
An exception, yeah.
All right, so we need to create a new exception for this, right?
And this already gives you the flavor of this struct thing that we've created for the value object. So on the one hand, we do have like the performance because this value object will live only on a stack. But the code itself is not that beautiful as it used to be, as it would be if we would decide to create this as a class.
Right. All right, so let's add this custom exception to our exceptions. It will be, of course, the domain exception, and we want to maybe provide here our resource ID
and the datetime.
And the datetime. Auto property, and let's make some meaningful message for this exception. So resource, or maybe cannot expropriate the resource with ID and the resource ID, reservation at, and then our date time and date. Okay, I think that looks fine.
Yeah.
So we have the exception. Now, if we actually manage to have the higher priority and we can remove this reservation, we can simply do reservations remove, colliding one. And here we'll probably need to make use of the domain events, right?
Yeah, basically, this is actually a good example of using the domain events. Remember, just keep in mind that adding the domain event in here will increment our version, which is what we actually need, because if we remember, the version is checked during the update. So we in here. So we need to add the event or do this manually by incrementing the version.
Yeah, and this will be useful because once we leave this if statement and we add in reservation, then without other if on a higher level, when we call this, when we invoke this method from some other place in our code, it will be hard to actually find out whether there was an existing one reservation that we removed or not, without doing some ifs on the previous value of the reservation collection. So
the domain event itself is a very meaningful message, right? And because this describes that something that already happened in our system. So I think that we can use this and eventually translate this to the integration event that will be published outside the microservice.
So for now, just like we have our resource created domain event for when we create a new resource via this static factory method, here let's create a new one, or even two new ones, for canceling the reservation, the existing one, and adding the new reservation.
Yeah.
So let's start with the new class, and let's call it reservation canceled. And the payload, so this will be domain event, which is a marker interface, and the payload for this will be just a resource and the, let's say, the reservation.
Yeah, we can put the whole aggregate in here because this will not leak outside of the microservice.
This will be handled somewhere internally within domain or application layer, so we'll never expose it to the outside world. And let's make it with parameters. strp. Come on. Okay, so we have it. Now pretty much the same event. So we can do copy and paste.
Yeah, for the reservation that was added.
Yeah, added. Same stuff. And now let's add these events into our internal events collection on the resource level. So we can do it even better. Let's say if we actually removed, if there was no issues with removing, let's just add event new reservation canceled, this and colliding reservation. And finally, it doesn't matter whether this branch happened or not. We want to add a new reservation. So if reservation add reservation, then we will add event new reservation added.
Yeah, so calling this method will basically can end up with two possible scenarios. The first one will be adding just one reservation added domain event.
If this is a new date time.
Yeah, so this meant that there was no colliding reservation for this particular resource. On the other hand, we would have the reservation cancelled and also together with the reservation added. So this means that we expropriated.
Or the third possible option is that we cannot expropriate, so we just throw an exception.
Yeah, we have the exception.
We would violate the domain, these aggregate invariants, the entity invariants.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move higher to the application layer.
Yeah, so we should start with the command. So the user's intention.
Let's call it reserve resource, right?
Yeah, the name should be imperative. So
yeah, and this will be I command type, which again is a marker interface. And here we will just pass our resource ID that you want to reserve.
Yeah, together with datetime and the priority.
The datetime. And finally, we will also need the priority.
Yeah, just keep in mind that the command itself should be implemented as a immutable object. So in here we don't have any public setters. Okay,
Right.
looks good. And finally,
The handler.
The handler.
Our use now we have the use case. Now we need to handle this use case somehow. So reserve resource handler, and let's just implement I command handler for our class, and let's make it async.
Yeah, we'll need for now, I think, just one dependency, which will be the repository for the
Right.
resources.
Our resources repository. So keep in mind that we stick to the public contract defined within our core. We don't care what's the underlying implementation of this, whether it's database or file store,
Yeah.
whatever, or in memory. So having this, let's at first check whether we have the resource or not. So just like we had this done previously within other resource handler, we could pretty much copy and paste scenario with this different check. If the resource is null, then we'll throw another custom exception like resource not found exception or whatever we call it.
Yeah. So this one will be, once again, this is the application exception, not the domain exception, simply because this is outside of the boundaries of the particular aggregate, right? For the aggregate's perspective, the aggregate always exists. So this is, yeah. So let's create a new one.
Yeah. So let me just do it fast way. So we had resource already exists. Now we will call it resource not found exception. And let's change the exception message. Wasn't found. And let's throw it here. Not found exception.
Okay.
Or resource ID. Okay, and finally, we just need to create a new reservation, add the reservation, and update our data.
Yeah.
So let's make a new value object, new reservation. For this comment, datetime, comment priority.
Yeah, we'll simply call the method that you just wrote.
So as you remember, the handler is nothing more than just orchestration of these business logic. We know which repositories, which factors, which postsheets should be injected, and we just call appropriate methods. And add reservation. And finally, we'll need to update the data. So we can just call our repo, update async.
Yeah, because if this exception will be thrown inside the aggregate, we will not get to this line, even though we have this implemented. Because remember that the command handler in our approach will only execute the happy path. So we assume that this line will execute, but it could not. And on the other hand, if we would proceed this method, we will end up with the version incremented inside the aggregates. Will be capable of actually updating this on the Mongo level.
So as we remember, within our update async, we of course do the update based on the aggregate ID, and we also want to ensure that the version is a valid version. So it's like not a slower version.
Yeah, and the version is restored we right after we fetch the data from the MongoDB, and we translate this database model to the domain model, right?
Yeah.
So we need to pass this version because otherwise we would have always the version would be the 0. So we would have no option actually to modify the state.
And the simple check will guarantee us that there will be like no issues with like concurrent, updates, for example, on the same entity. So just verify that we have this in place. Let me check the extensions where we do mappings between our data model document and the entity. And it seems that we probably need to add the version as well. Yeah, reservations and a version. So let's do a quick fix here. So document version. Okay, seems good now. So I think we can move to the web API layer, our presentation layer, finally. So let's open the program CS, and here let's just add new endpoint. So we have get resources, get resource, add new resource. So let's just do post for the add resource command, and the reserve resource. Reserve resource. And let's make the path resources and then slash. Let's make it look RESTful way. So resources, resource ID.
The reservations.
Yeah, reservations. And you could either leave it this way or just have it daytime here as well, whatever.
Yeah, I can leave it.
Yeah. All right, so I
Yeah, that is
think
good.
that's pretty much it. Let's just put a breakpoint within our handler and within our business logic somewhere here, just so we see that it actually works. And I think that right now we can start the web API.
Yeah.
So we'll run this in the debug mode.
Yeah, this will take a while, and we'll once again we'll use the Visual Studio Code and the REST client extension.
So let's switch to VS Code. Just keep in mind that we are using the REST client all the time. And let's try to reserve a resource. So the first time, maybe let's add a new resource just to make sure that we didn't break anything. So we'll call add new resource. We have a new resource with this ID. We can also see that this resource is actually there.
Yeah, we
without
have no reservations.
We can also check on a database level if the data is here. So we will create a new connection with default values using this robo3t free client for MongoDB. And then let's see. So we should, I think, have about free resources from the previous lessons already created. Yeah, so we have free, no reservation added. And now let's call reserve resource. So post, resource ID, date time, priority. Okay. All right, so we have our breakpoint in the handler. Now let's go further. We are looking for colliding reservation. Next, there were no colliding reservations, so we simply add new reservation. Yeah. And then we just call the update.
Yeah, so we can see in
Mongo and on the web API level. So let's try to do get. Resource is there. And let's try to refresh the database.
Yeah, so we have resource with
it should also be there. So now let's try another branch maybe. So maybe let's try to produce an error.
Yeah, so basically what we need to do is
just call it
again. The same because
with the same priority and say date time, right?
Yeah.
So resource. All right, now we will get this colliding reservation and we'll hit this exception. And as you might remember, we have this exception to response mapper defined here, which will map our domain application exception into the custom code based on it will take this code name from the exception type.
So this gives us meaningful HTTP response, yeah.
So we will see this cannot expropriate reservation, which we can then display on the UI and translate it into like different language. And we have some reason, what caused this error. And so let's try to expropriate someone. Let's say priority 1. Let's call it one more time. Okay, now as you can see, we are removing the existing reservation. We are adding the new reservation. And here you will notice that our resource will contain now 2 domain events. The one for removing and the one for adding new reservation. So cancel and add it. And for now, we are not using these events yet. But once we get into the message broker and event-driven architecture, you will see how we can map those or translate those domain events into the integration events and, for example, publish this information to the other microservices.
Yeah, and also this domain approach will actually, since we are within our domain, within our microservice, we can simply even I would say the more complex business process could be modularized using this events and the handler patterns, right? Because we could simply publish the domain event which will be dispatched within our microservice, and maybe some other process would be processed. Yeah,
right. So like the goal of the domain events is to decouple like internal business logic or some internal handlers into different pieces, so we don't have to keep like everything in a single handler, which can grow big again. On the other hand, if we want to publish this event to some other services within our distributed system, we can just translate this domain event into integration event. So our domain will not leak out to the outside world, and then we just publish even different payload, maybe just something like reservation added resource ID or datetime, right? So our domain will not leak. Yeah.
So to sum it up, basically what we've done so far. So we have this, since we do follow the clean architecture, we have these boundaries. I think that the boundaries are pretty clear, right? So we have the core in which we do follow the object-oriented programming. So we try we do our best to follow this
Right.
this good practices of the programming, right? So we create the aggregate. The aggregate itself encapsulates its property and its internal state just by exposing the public API and this, which are the methods using which you can actually modify the state.
Right, and the aggregate is responsible for taking care of its internal state. So whenever we will try to violate our invariants, like creating the resource with invalid or missing tags, or trying to expropriate someone with lower priority, it will just throw an exception or return an error in a different way. So we want our business logic to be clean from any dependencies or some validators or some other pieces, other layers that would then have to validate whether our aggregate is in a valid or invalid state. It should be kept here.
Also keep in mind that if your aggregate or maybe the business rule requires some third-party tools or maybe some additional libraries, because keep in mind that the core itself will not have any dependencies to the libraries, then you can simply create a port which will be injected right after into the aggregate and implement this, let's say, on the infrastructure level as an adapter, right? So this will allow you to have the usage of this, but not breaking these rules of the clean architecture.
And in the next sections, we'll also extend our handler a little bit. But again, whenever we start adding like additional logging, some exception handling, retry policies, tracing, monitoring, and these sort of things, our application handlers, our use cases will remain the same. So all of these additional cross-checking concerns around them will be kept in a different layers. So the application logic doesn't change at all. Yeah.
So I think that's pretty much it for this module. And having this solid foundation, I think that we are ready to move further. And adding some new piece to our infrastructure, which would be message broker. So we will see basically how we can actually plug it, how we can make use of it. And
we'll also see some difference between data consistency, like immediate and eventual consistency in this asynchronous event-driven world.
Yeah, and we'll also discuss the message delivery and how we can actually guarantee
with outbox inbox patterns and how to tackle the other challenges.
So that's it for this module, and we'll see you in the next one.